Just waiting for people to get started. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Sanjay Ratnavel. I'm the president of OESIS. Today we're talking about DEI and planning for DEI. Just give everybody a second to get acclimated. We have about 60 participants today, potentially. Welcome, Michael. Still waiting for Josh Friedman. So while we're waiting, let me just do a little introduction to Intrepid. For those of you who are not familiar with Intrepid, we launched a newspaper called Intrepid Ed News, which does all these particular stories on innovation in particular. We have a series on DEI, and this is part of the series on DEI. What's the real plan for DEI? We're joined today by 6 Seconds, and Josh Friedman, who's their CEO, is joining us in a second. And also we have Michael Eatman, who is a 6 Seconds preferred partner and a DEI specialist. Welcome, Josh. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you. Hello.
So listen, guys, thank you for coming on again. This is a short webinar like last time. So for all of you attendees, please put your questions in. We're going to leave a few minutes at the end for questions, but we really need you to put them in the chat thread. Michael's going to monitor that chat thread, and so am I. So let's get started. Josh, thank you and Michael for writing this series on DEI planning. I think this is one of the most important series that we've got going right now, because it deals with an invisible barrier that I think is generally ignored, and that is the challenges of changing culture. And independent schools have attacked culture change in a variety of different ways. In my experience, I think top of the list has usually been recruitment as a way to get down there, followed by strategic planning. And strategic planning and recruitment have their limitations. So why don't you give us a overview first of the part one of the plan for DEI, and then we can get into Quadrant 2, which is the focus of this webinar.
Michael, you want to start, or shall I?
I'm excited to jump in, but Josh, why don't you start with one? And I was just looking over the article for part 2, and I was having memories of how important it is. So I'll jump in after you get started.
So when Michael and I started talking about this article, it came out of years of conversations we've had with schools and also all kinds of other organizations, from banks to military organizations to community organizations, about how they are thinking about DEI and culture. And one of the things that we've noticed is that frequently when we get into a conversation with people who work in this space, they say, this is the way this has to work. And if you don't do it this way, it's a big problem. And it's like they're standing in one of these 4 perspectives, and it's quite difficult to see that the other perspectives are also important. One of the frequent places that people go first is Quadrant 4. Let's take action. Let's do programs. Let's teach people the concepts they need. And that's important. Then what happens? How do we connect that to budget? How do we connect that to strategy? How do we measure the impact? How do we make sure that this is actually woven into the fabric of the organization? And that work is less exciting in some ways. But if we don't do that work, the programs are going to go away. And so we've all seen many, as Sanjay said, many schools trying to do this work of SEL and culture and DEI, of culture change, of building an institutional context where people can come together and do their work well, and a broad range of stakeholders feels that it's their place. But few schools do it well. And we think that starting in Quadrant 1 and really saying, well, what is our vision? What is our mission? How does this work of DEI and SEL build the culture that we need in order to achieve that? How are we going to measure that? How are we going to budget for it? How are we going to make those decisions? Starting there, but not staying there, and not staying there for too long. Because if we try to do that and we say, okay, here's the plan, we're going to roll it out, and we haven't done the other quadrants, it's going to come apart. So very quickly, we start with quadrant 1 with this data and metrics and where we're going to go. And then we need to jump right over to quadrant 2.
So Josh, let me dive in there a little bit before Michael contributes. Let's take an area like inclusion, right, which is generally tends to be the main focus. How are you talking about trying to develop a strategy around inclusion and in quadrant 1, and then saying to yourself, well, we have a strategy, but we're not really sure the degree to which we can go down and meet the other pieces of DEI that relate to inclusion, such as equity, and such as potentially justice, and such as potentially the benefits of diversity?
Well, I think I wouldn't make a strategy for inclusion. What I would do is I'd make a strategy for a great school. And I'd recognize that inclusion, diversity, equity, justice are part of the strategy of a great school. And I think disconnecting aspects of your culture ends up with fragmentation. And instead saying, why do we exist here as a school? There are a lot of schools out there. We don't need yours just to be a school. Like, what's it here for? Like, oh, okay, we teach kids for the future success of the world. Great, so what? Like, what are you really about? What is your contribution? What is this school going to do for your community, for the world? Figure that out and understand that DEI is an essential ingredient of that. It's not a sidebar. That's quadrant 1.
Yeah, Josh and Sanjay, thanks for digging into that. I think that's really important to think about how we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, because I think it's everything that we do. However, when we say diversity, it can easily become to conversation about race or gender or any of the other aspects of diversity. So really in this quadrant 1, it's important because it's about strategic design. And so even though you want to have programming and activities, you can hire a DEI officer and they can come in and do a lot of good work. However, if you don't cast a vision, that person will they'll get tired. It's no way to really measure it. So what I say is that how do we connect cultural competence to the organization's bottom line? So therefore DEI is everything that we do, but we understand DEI or JEDI, DEIJ in a larger sense, which really helps us in quadrant 1 to think about what's the strategy and the metrics, because part of those pieces are found in quadrant 4.
So when you say metrics, could you expand a little bit more on what that means in terms of real measurability at both an institutional level and a more granular level?
Yeah, so when I think about, again, I know we're in quadrant 2, but we're still in quadrant 1. If I do some of the typical or the normal programming, the cultural programming, the cultural events, these are really important. However, if I don't say, how do I measure? Like, what is the measure that's going to say we've moved down the line? I think we don't think about that on the front end. So therefore, you can have a school year where you've done 10 sessions, 10 programs, and it's really not, you don't feel like you're any further because you haven't started with a measurement on the front end, which is why climate assessments, and many people are doing climate assessments, are saying, where do we want to begin? Like Josh said, who do we want to be? And being a good school has these different elements in it.
But Josh, you have done many climate assessments across the world, yeah, right? And you can do climate assessments, but what do you compare it to?
Right. So we publish a normed, validated assessment tool for schools. And if you don't have norms, it's very hard to know what you're comparing to. So we take a psychometric approach to this, and we look at individual competency and we look at organizational outcomes, and we measure school climate aspects like belonging and safety, emotional safety. And a lot of those are actually in quadrant 2, because in some ways it's easier to measure the pieces in quadrant one, like what is our budget? How many people do we have who've really built skills? To what degree have we paid attention to DEI in our programming? Those more visible aspects are actually easier to measure, but the relational aspects and having a normed, validated way of saying, yeah, we actually know where we stand right now in terms of the level of trust in this community. And then we're going to do the work in quadrant two to work on that. I think that's where we get into a really different approach that's powerful.
So let's talk a little bit more on quadrant two and what that really entails. I like, in particular, your fish don't think about water analogy, because that's really very much what we're talking about here. What are the kinds of things that are typical that you would recommend a school would do in quadrant two? And what are the risks of not doing it?
Yeah, Michael, you want to jump in there? What happens if you don't do quadrant two?
Yeah, I think when you don't do quadrant two, there's an alignment that's missed. And this idea of fish don't talk about water, you can see a problem and learn not to deal with it. And the challenge for, I sometimes say, be soft on people and hard on barriers. It's like, how do we actually move from, it's okay to be soft on people. Soft doesn't mean be weak. Soft doesn't mean not to challenge, but to really begin to say, what is the barrier? And sometimes it's a communication barrier. And so even to be in a position, let's say I'm a senior leader at an organization, the assumption is that we can talk as colleagues. But if that is not the environment that someone walks into at the senior level, what happens for someone that works as a teacher or someone that works in maintenance? There's no relationship. And I think many schools like ours operate in silos. And so I like to talk about the alignment phases, asking questions like, how do you want to be treated? I've used that simple question for 10 years. And every time I use that, you think it's quick. The first time I did, I thought it would be quick, but 2 hours later, you find out that all of the elements of DEI come out. One person says they process slow. One person of color said they're having microaggressions happening. One person says they like to move quickly. And in that conversation, the truth is coming out. And you can't just ask that question before you have a strategy, because that has to be connected to the strategy so people feel like they're moving towards something.
One of the things that we've seen is that often the strategies are made by a relatively small group of people. And one of the things that I'm learning as a white man is that there is data in the school context, in the community, wherever space I'm in, there's data that I am not seeing and I don't have to see because of my privilege. Part of privilege is I don't have to pay attention to this. And that there are other people in the community who have to see it because it's part of their survival, it's part of how they're going to make it through the day. And so they're paying attention to things that I'm not paying attention to. And so if I stay in quadrant one with my privilege and my positionality, and I'm somebody who's really good at making strategies. It's I'm a CEO of an organization. I love strategies. And but if I try to do that in quadrant one and I stay in quadrant one, number one, I'm not going to get the data. Number two, I'm going to put out this plan. I'm not going to get buy-in. 70 to 90% of organizational change efforts fail. And what we found when we wrote our book, Inside Change, is that the vast majority of that failure is a failure to get people on board. So we're spending billions of dollars a year on efforts for organizational change in schools and other kinds of organizations. And most of that is not going anywhere. And most of that is because of a failure to get people on board. And that is the work of Quadrant 2.
And Sanjay, I know you, as I look at your eyes, I know you have some good things to say. I want to jump in for one more second on that, because I think the catchphrase for a lot of senior leaders is to come up with a prompt. Let me use this prompt with my team. And you use it with your team, but after the first prompt, what do you do after that? When someone actually tells you that they're hemorrhaging, when you hear a female colleague say, I feel like I'm being taken advantage of, what do you as the leader do? There has to be some major development of senior leaders in this area, because you can't just take the latest and greatest book that you've read and share it with your community. because it's hard to take someone somewhere where you haven't been. So this is important for the leaders as well as for the community. And it's a really important place that many of us, including, at times us on the call, that are challenging for us to move into.
Yeah, I was thinking because you guys were making fun of me when I was, Dennis Biscard at least was making fun of me last time when I was talking about how my wife was recommending I do more SEL work. And it goes back to this issue about leadership, right? I mean, I think what I'm hearing is that in Quadrant 2, the leaders will often come up with some kind of strategy, an overall strategy that they think represents an institutional direction. And it may be more or less from the bottom up as well as from the top down. But what they're going to discover in Quadrant 2 is that there are going to be a lot of assumptions that they don't realize people have about themselves, right? And they're going to find out about themselves. So I think there's probably quite a lot of discovery here for leadership in Quadrant 2 that will end up going back into the strategy plan. I mean, schools generally have tended to be command and control environments, right? I mean, they've been that because of the way in which they're structured, and the way in which they're scheduled, amongst other things. So is that right?
Yeah.
Is that?
And then we could go further into the systems in which they operate. I was talking yesterday to the head of a administrative credential program at a university, and saying, I would really like to move to an outcome-based model and move away from the way we do our credits and our structure of our courses that are so disintegrated. And he said, but I can't, because I'm accredited by the state. And the state is looking at ours.
Yeah,
and check boxes.
We have a big series going on accreditation, and let's put that one on a side.
So let me just add something about Quadrant 2, which is both Quadrant 2 and Quadrant 3 are fish don't talk about water spaces. Okay, they're both in the implicit side. In other words, what's internal, what's not obvious. Explicit, what's visible above the water line in the iceberg. Quadrants 2 and 3 are below the water line. The difference between Quadrant 2 and 3 is that in Quadrant 2, we're focused on the culture and the longer term strategic aspects of that iceberg. And in Quadrant 3, we're focused on the individual and the internal and the relational. So Quadrant 3, we'll talk about in a couple of weeks, is going to be like the relationship that we establish with each other and with ourselves. Quadrant 2 is the norms, how those relationships become norms. So how do your board members talk to each other? What's normal for your board? And when we say normal, then we're talking about norms. What's normal about the way that people who are coming, whoever's in the majority in your school community, what's normal for them about talking to people who are in the minority in your school community? What happens when somebody comes in and says, I think that there's a group of people here that we're not really serving very well? What normally happens? And these things that normally happen, not at an individual relational level, but more at a systemic level, these are going to drive the long-term adoption or non-adoption of the strategy.
And how do you correlate how people have evaluated themselves in this domain to the area of building cultural relationships? Because we've had all kinds of evaluation systems at schools. What's your experience on how that can help or hinder this discussion?
Well, one thing I'll just mention is we were talking about the systems before, the context in which these things happen, and the reason we become more hierarchical, et cetera, in schools. We tend to measure performance based on individuals. And we tend to have, whether it's in the corporate sector or the education sector, we have individual performance reviews, we have individual goals. And in some ways, that's totally contrary to what we're trying to achieve in Quadrant 2.
Got it. Start thinking about your questions. We've only got 10 minutes left. What else do we need to focus on in terms of tangible tools in navigating Quadrant 2 and Quadrant 3? I suppose the climate assessment is kind of going from 1 to 2. What goes from 2 to 3 in terms of data and tools?
Well, Sanjay, I don't know if you want to just pop over to the article for a second. We have a couple of pieces there in this week's article about Quadrant 2 of one thing is about, the risk that's here. One of the reasons it's hard to do that, but we have some questions to discuss.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, these discussion questions might be really fruitful for those of you who are watching and on the call to think about, well, what would it be like for you? And I'm curious, those of you who are here, if you could share in the chat, like, how would it be for you to really engage in these 3 questions? How honest an answer would you get?
Yeah, put your hand up. I will. I'm looking at the attendees right now. If you want to just contribute here, just put the hand sign up, and I will unmute you. I know that I can see quite a lot of people here who I know, Raj and Joel and Catherine and others. Yeah, please do participate. But give us a little bit of sense of what you think some of the answers are to these questions, or some of the responses rather. Josh. Michael.
I'll jump in for a moment. I'm looking at number 2. To what degree do we have alignment among leadership groups on the work of equity? I think that's a question that is actually not even, it's a question that's avoided, because it can be disguised in equity, but it's how does the school run? Are we in alignment? If you ask any 3 leaders, you will probably find out that the person who is the decision maker has one purview and the other team members have a different purview. So that number 2 is a tough one, because it's the person that's driving it has usually done a lot of work, and the people that are on board may not be as far along in the conversation.
I have a tough question about number 1, which is, how many of you who are on this call or watching this call who are white folks, how many of you can raise your hand and say, yeah, I'm a leader toward equity? And how does that land for you? Because I think for myself as a white man, I was struggling with this. Do I have a voice in this conversation? I'm not an expert in this. I don't have the lived experience of being a target of inequity, of racism, of sexism. Like, I have so many places of privilege. How do I stand up for this? And I think for myself, learning that this is part of leadership and maybe even central to leadership, for me, that's been a very powerful learning.
We've got a question from Taylor. Taylor, are you there?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Where are you from, Taylor?
I'm from Chicago. It wasn't so much a question, but I was just, you guys had asked, like, what would it look like if we were able to actually engage with these questions? And I was just saying that, like, our faculty and staff really actually love to engage in conversations like these and are actually like pretty hungry for it a lot of times. But, in those conversations, they usually lead to, like the people crying and not really, like people like not really being honest. Like they will be like clearly reflective, but won't share their thoughts around like how their actions and everything have like impacted their coworkers. And you can tell that there's like, serious thought and serious reflection happening, but those things aren't shared and people aren't taking, like public responsibility for their behaviors and actions towards others. And so, like for me, I just think, what would it look like to actually sit down and have these conversations? I think it could be really transformative, and we keep getting up to the line, but not quite crossing it. So, yeah, that's just what kind
of environments are you talking about, Taylor? Are you talking about faculty meetings? Are you talking about specific meetings?
Yeah, there will be all group discussions, and we've had like smaller conversations. So we'll have sometimes we'll be discussing it as a faculty at large, and then sometimes we'll break into smaller groups. It just depends. And so yeah, we have them in a number of settings.
And do you feel like this conversation about culture, do you feel like, you don't need to reveal which school you're at, but do you think that your experience at the schools that you've been at and the school that you're at do enough work on the cultural segments?
I think we could do more because, there's still a number of people of color on the staff who feel disenfranchised and unheard and disrespected. And so, like, even though there is that self-reflection going on, it's not really addressing the like day-to-day behaviors of of coworkers.
Yeah, Taylor, I really appreciate.
And Taylor, what?
Oops.
I was going to say the same thing. Go, Michael.
Even as we're reflecting, this is a powerful example of the kind of support that schools need. And it reminds me of, if I just give you a prompt, and you start talking about it, if there's tears, you have to have someone who can facilitate that. Not to shut the person's tears down, whether they're whatever the ethnic identity is or the gender, but to be able to work with that. And we talk about how do we work with the challenge. So if someone's crying, and this is free, everyone can take this. If you say, if your tears could talk, what would they say? Because what happens is I start crying. If you watch any of the things that Josh and I have done over the last year, I've cried all over the nation. And culturally speaking, for me growing up as a Black man, that's not what I was taught to do. However, the combination of emotional intelligence, cultural competence has given me some space, but also have environments that are allowing that. So I think we need to have the space to do that. And prime is how do we have the skill set to lead people through that? It's really important, Taylor, because in particular, people of color share their perspectives. And sometimes you talked about being unheard and disrespected. So we have to learn how to work with those experiences. And I want to step back so Josh can jump in.
Well, Sanjay, if you can go back to the quadrants, Taylor, what I'm hearing is your faculty is hungry for these conversations in quadrant 2. They need more of the skills in quadrant 3 to be able to tune into themselves and share. And they need to do the quadrant 4 so that they actually learn new practices and they learn new ways of engaging. And then that's going to inform quadrant 1, which is going to help create more systems and policies and measures. So, in what you shared, I think it answers the question that Sanjay, you started on, is like, how do we go from 2 to 3? Like, okay, so this is our norm. Here's the thing. Now, what do I need to learn? And now what are the skills that I can bring forward? And what are the practices that we can teach each other and learn? And then how do we systematize those?
Yes, we have some chat questions. Rush, I love these questions. Nice to have you. Nice to see you. It's been a while. It's what you're saying is in many ways is that quadrant 1 is really quadrant 5 after a while, right? And we could be doing these webinars forever. 5, 6, 7, and 8, because it never stops. And this isn't really a finite planning. Sorry,
Sanjay, I just would say that what's coming up for me is the importance that each of these quadrants, you just don't say, let's take 6 months in quadrant 1. These are a system of working together. So I like the idea of quadrant 5. We won't deal with that today, but the fact that they're constantly cycling through. Here's my strategy. Here's connecting. Here's the programming. Here's the strategy. It's a square, but it's really a wheel. And so I think that's important for listeners.
Right. I'm going to unmute someone who hasn't asked to talk, only because I haven't heard from her. I'd love to get her point of view, and she's an expert. Rush, I just unmuted you. Would you kindly unmute yourself and give us a little bit of your sense of this whole topic? Are you there, Rush?
Hi, Sanjay. Yeah, thank you so much.
So I'm sure you have some great stuff here, and you know Josh, I'm sure too, right?
I don't know Josh, but I love everything you're saying. I have also a colleague on the call, Elizabeth, and I don't know that I have a lot to add, because I think what you've said is just so powerful and right on the money. So I agree with what you're saying. I think that I agree with the participant who spoke up about how hungry schools are for those questions and for a safe place to dive into them. I also just love what you said about the piece of having a facilitator there ready to help when feelings escalate or arise. And I'm just not sure, though. I guess my question is how to get everyone where they need to be on these quadrants on our page. I guess how to get leaders, the leaders of the leaders, to buy in. I guess that's where I'm landing right now.
Yeah, and that's really one of the impeti one of the reasons why we wanted to write this article was to say, let's talk about this in a more systemic way. And for some DEI leaders, for some education leaders, for some system leaders, to think about how can we look at this elephant, the parable of the blind man and the elephant. How can we look at this elephant from multiple perspectives? And I think part of our hope in this, in writing this article, is that we can invite a conversation where people who tend to stand in one quadrant are more open to the conversation about the other quadrants.
Yeah, I'm going to thank you, Rush, and Elizabeth, you're unmuted too if you want to say something. But I have a kind of related question to this, and that is, when a lot of people have gone down this route of putting a title of community engagement as opposed to inclusion or equity, diversity and community engagement. And I think what's going on there is that it's been put into a cultural community bucket. And that is more like, the soft stuff that goes outside of the classroom. To me, that's a big danger, right? Because obviously that's only a small piece of what goes on at a school. Thoughts?
Elizabeth,
I just go back to what I said earlier. Is this peripheral or is this central? And if it's not central, it's not really going to happen. If as a board, as a C-level team in a school, if this isn't central to you achieving your vision, then it's not going to happen.
Yeah, and just on the title, and then I'd love to hear Elizabeth on the title, community engagement. I think the title, it depends on the person who's the leader to frame that. Oftentimes for DEI leaders who have the director for community engagement, if that title is actually cast appropriately, what that can do is position the DEI leader as a senior leader, really on par with the head of school. And so I think there's a lot of growth opportunity for heads of school to understand that there needs to be space for leaders to grow. But if those positions are marginalized in this community leader, they're not going to ever get after what they need to do. And so that's,
I think it's been upgraded pretty high up at this point.
Which is just so important.
Elizabeth?
Oh, I don't know that I have anything, to add that's new. There's so many things that you've said that I'm just, pondering and that are really resonating with me. Some of the first question that you posed, Josh, about, or it wasn't really a question, but just the idea of, being a great school, like thinking about this as, I don't know. I'm not sure that I have anything to add. It's a lot about, but the other thing that Michael, you said that I really liked was thinking about this as a kind of a wheel, because it's all happening at the same time, and where you enter into the wheel is an interesting thought. I'm processing a lot, so I don't think I'm adding anything.
I'm curious, Elizabeth, and all of you, which quadrant is your comfort zone?
Mm-hmm.
I've been thinking about this. That quadrant 2 is the one where I'm just like, yeah, this is my jam. What's the rest of you? Which quadrant is your jam?
Yeah, I think for me, I can only speak for myself. Quadrant 2 probably, although we engage in all of these quadrants. but that is a great, I mean, that's a great self-reflection piece for anyone who's doing this work to think about, and which is the one that's the least comfortable.
Yeah. Well, with that, I think we will draw this to a close. We're already 5 minutes over. Thank you all for participating. Thanks, Josh. Thanks, Michael, in particular. We'll be back, I think, in a week or two. Can't remember when the next one is, discussing Quadrant 3 and the transition to Quadrant 4. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.